MetaWare High School Demo was one of the most surprising games I ever played, and I don't think I will ever play another game quite like it. When I booted it up for the first time, I was expecting some lighthearted, fourth-wall-breaking comedy and some fun interactions. What I got? Well, it was sometimes that, but most of the time it was existential dread. I would highly recommend this game, but doing so almost seems antithetical to some parts of the game itself, but I digress. Playing through the game, I was surprised by the depths of the characters, and while I really enjoyed Hope and Nari, even though the latter is one of the most terrifying characters I have ever had the pleasure, or maybe displeasure, of witnessing in all of fiction, my favorite in the bunch ended up being good ol' Applehead Chris. And she's not just my favorite in the gang, she is, without a doubt, my favorite character that I was introduced to from the past few months at least. To start off a bit differently, let's take a quick look at her design. Of all the characters in MetaWare High School, she has my favorite design. And I guess by that I mostly mean hairstyle. There isn't much to say regarding it besides the aforementioned humorous apple shape, but it's just a fun design overall and helped endear me to her. I'm sure that everyone that hasn't played the game is already questioning the lack of eyes, and while I won't get into it in this video, I'll sum it up as an artistic choice that adds a lot to the narrative for all of the characters later on in the story. That aside, time to talk about the actual character. But to preface this, a brief fact about the game that must be known. As I hinted at earlier, this is a world where everyone is aware of their existence as visual novel characters, and the player isn't represented with an in-game character, the player is simply the player. Alright, now we can finally get into it. As I progressed through the game, clearing route after route, I didn't think too much of Chris. Of the gang, she probably had the least bombastic personality and was overall the most reserved and shy one. Barring Nari, but she was less shy and more seething with hatred at any given moment. She did have some moments with more characterization, like her taking the longest to start dancing in the dance route, long story how that happened, and then feigning disappointment in her friends for dancing, so she could then pull the rug out by doing the best dance of all of them. There's also the numerous times where she gets very on edge whenever Aspen, one of the other primary characters, insists that they are in a dating sim. The genre is left intentionally ambiguous for this, with Chris being vehemently against these assertions. The dancing moment certainly endeared me to Chris immensely, but these reactions to Aspen's assertions about, essentially, the very nature of their world, left me with a lot of curiosity about what her whole story was. Thankfully, there is indeed a route where I got to learn more about Chris upon playing it, and getting through this route was very, very painful. After a route full of the player making a fool of themselves and undermining every attempt by the gang to get to know them, as well as them encouraging Aspen's belief that the game is a dating sim, Chris finally snaps. She becomes utterly infuriated by the blind trust that Aspen put into the player, even after everything they had done in this route to make a fool of themselves, and before leaving in hysterics, she gets up close and personal with the player and tells them how much she had once looked forward to their arrival. At this point, the player has the chance to follow Chris and apologize for their mistakes if they can choose the right options to convince the remaining friends to even let them. As soon as I got to this point, I genuinely felt bad for what I had done to her. This game does an excellent job of letting you suspend your disbelief and believe these are real people you're interacting with, all while acknowledging their status as visual novel characters. And I'd say my desire to apologize, not for the sake of ending the route, but because I genuinely felt bad, speaks volumes to how well the game accomplishes the goal it set out to do. So when I finally got to speak to Chris after this moment, she revealed her true colors. It turns out that, as bizarre as it is, Chris is actually an avid player of visual novels herself, despite being a character in one. She commented on her experiences with various genres of them, saying that she loved the feeling of getting to know characters in her visual novels. She loved feeling important to them. No matter what their character was, if they wanted to spend time with her, if they wanted to be in a relationship with her, even if they wanted to kill her, she always got to play the role as the most special person in their lives. Around this point, she trailed off in her thinking, but I find it pretty clear that she was looking forward to the arrival of the player because she wanted to meet someone that felt that important to her. But at the same time, this terrified her. In this speech, she does mention that she's not sure if she's interested in romance, so she definitely must have had underlying terror regarding the possibility of this being a dating sim, as if she'd simply be resigned to her fate regardless of if she wanted a relationship or not. As she goes on, she starts to realize how ridiculous it is that she's telling all of these secrets to the person she should probably trust the least out of everyone, but then she projects herself on the player, and starts to ponder if they really are as bad as they were acting. As a visual novel player herself, she'd certainly been a jerk to plenty of characters, so maybe the player was just like that, just trying to get through every route, but in real life, maybe they were a good person. After all, they came to check in on her. Although, even with this benefit of the doubt, it still hurt like hell for her to be treated like that, and she had a much different image in her mind about how meeting her special player would go. In this route where the player got to truly know her, in the route where I got to know her, they were nothing but a disappointment, but maybe that's why she was able to talk to them at all. Because they were an imperfect person and just some visual novel player like her. As I reached the end of this route, I felt so bad for her. Again, even though she isn't real, even by her own admission, excusing the player's actions by reminding herself that she's just a fantasy. It felt so bittersweet to see her pour out her soul, but only after I had been so awful to her. Not only that, but she also minimized her own suffering by comparing herself to her fictitious visual novel friends. And while in reality she isn't any different from any visual novel character, seeing her put herself down to that extent just hurt to see. No form of media had ever succeeded in making me feel this attached to a fictional character like they were a real person, and I find it hard to believe that any other story will match this level of attachment for me. That's not even where the tragedy of this world with no fourth walls and how it has weighed on Chris ends, but with how entangled it is in the web of other events and feelings that make up the ending, I'll leave it at this. In spite of the tragedy that her very existence has made her endure, Chris still manages to hold on to hope that her life as a fictional character has meant something, saying the following in the ending: "But we are real to him. If we're real to him, then that makes us real, doesn't it?" Well, by the end of it all, even if I knew it was all a game, I can say with confidence that all of it certainly felt real. MetaWare High School Demo was a beautiful story, sometimes humorous, often surreal, often tragic, but in the end, it was something beautiful to me.